Be careful around here. Rosa Fuentes said it without inflection, without warning in her voice. Just the bare statement of a fact she had learned over 11 years of standing on the same corner of Main and Callaway in downtown Kellerton, Texas. She said it to the man who had just arrived with a hot dog cart at 6:47 on a Tuesday morning in August. The kind of morning where the heat comes up from the asphalt before the sun clears the storefronts, and the light is already broken into pieces across the sidewalk. David Carr, though that was not his name, though it would not be his name for 18 months, turned toward her voice. He was tall, broad-shouldered, the kind of man built for physical work, though his hands were too clean, too unblemished for real work. And there was something in the way he stood that suggested he had learned to make himself smaller in spaces than his size would naturally have warranted. He looked at Rosa directly. Meeting her eyes for the full 3 seconds, she held the statement between them before looking back at her taco cart. "Understood," he said. He did not ask what to be careful about. He did not ask who or what. He just acknowledged the warning and began arranging his supplies with the kind of methodical precision that suggested he had done this before. Not hot dog vending, necessarily, but the waiting that comes before anything else. He had a gas canister, a griddle, a small cooler, plastic gloves, napkins in 3 colors, condiments in bottles that he had labeled himself in block letters. Everything organized, everything in its place. Rosa watched him for another moment. She was 64, with hands that had learned their precision from her late husband, who had built the taco cart by hand from reclaimed metal and salvaged wheels in the year before he died. She had 3 children and 7 grandchildren, and she had paid $300 every single month for 4 years without telling any of them. Because she did not want them to worry, and she did not believe anyone would help anyway. She had learned not to trust systems. She had learned that the only real safety is the safety you keep quiet about. But there was something in the way this man stood, in the quality of his stillness, in the fact that he met her eyes and did not look away too soon, that made her think he might understand what she was really saying. Not be careful about petty theft. Not be careful about aggressive customers. Not be careful in the way you tell a friend to be careful about a restaurant with bad reviews. Something else. Something deeper. So she turned back to her cart and began her morning work. The slow heating of the oil, the careful arrangement of the already prepared carnitas and al pastor, the laying out of the fresh onions and cilantro, the work that had kept her present on this corner every day for 11 years, the work that meant something, or had meant something, before the work had become a way to survive the collections. She did not speak to him again, but she watched him peripherally as he opened his cooler and pulled out a hot dog, which he set on his griddle, waiting for the surface to warm. It was still before 7 in the morning. The stores on the block were just beginning to unlock their gates. A bodega on the corner, Santos and Sons. Though Santos had passed 3 years ago, and his widow ran it with her daughter now, was pulling up its security gate. The laundromat next to it flickered on its lights. The corner itself was still mostly quiet, a kind of held breath before the day turned over into commerce. Damien Cross, because that was his name, though only 4 people in all of Kellerton knew it, stood at his cart and waited. He had been in position for exactly 15 minutes, and he would stand here every morning for the next 18 months unless the assignment changed, which it would not because the Public Corruption Unit of the U.S. Marshal Service did not assign you to a corner for 18 months and then have you move. The assignment was about patience. The assignment was about watching. The assignment was about standing in a particular place until all the corruption that moved through that place, like water through a system, revealed itself to the eye that knew how to see it. He thought about Marcus, as he did every morning, not in a way that was distracting. Damien Cross had learned 11 years ago. 3 days after his brother's traffic stop went wrong. How to hold grief in a part of his mind that did not interfere with work, but as a kind of tether, a reminder of why the waiting mattered. Marcus had been 23 years old when the officer stopped him. Marcus had not done anything wrong. Marcus had driven a 2004 Honda Civic the color of rust, and he had called Damien every Sunday without fail. And the last call had come 3 days before the traffic stop, when Damien was on shift and had let it go to voicemail. The voicemail was still there. On a phone Damien kept in a drawer at his apartment in Houston. It had been 11 years. He had never deleted it. He had listened to it maybe 4 times in the first year after Marcus died. And he had never listened to it again because he could not afford to have that texture in his voice. The casual warmth of a brother calling his older brother to talk about nothing important, about a barbecue place that had opened, about a neighbor's dog. He could not afford to have that texture in his head when he was standing on a street corner pretending to be David Carr. A man recently divorced. A man starting over with a hot dog cart, because that was the kind of man who would be on a corner for 18 months and would not have the kind of federal infrastructure around him that would make local police suspicious. A man. In other words, with nothing, with nobody, with no reason to notice or care about who was collecting money from the vendors. The first customer arrived at 7:22 a.m. He was an older man, probably in his 70s. Moving with the careful precision of someone who had learned over decades how to make his body do what it was told, despite the body's regular objections. He ordered a hot dog with everything, and he ate it while standing on the corner, his eyes on the street, not on Damien, not on Rosa, not on anything in particular. When he left money on the cart's edge. $2 for a dog that cost $1.75, and he did not ask for change. By 8:15 a.m., Damien had served 7 customers. By 9 a.m., he had served 12. By 10 a.m., he had served 23. The routine was straightforward and unbendable. He took orders. He assembled hot dogs. He rang up transactions in a small ledger he kept visible. Everything above board. Everything legal. Everything that suggested he was exactly what he appeared to be, a man making a modest living serving breakfast and lunch to the people on a street corner in downtown Kellerton. Nobody came to collect money from him that first morning. He had expected that. The test had to come after he had established himself, after Rosa and the other vendors had seen him enough to know his pattern, to know that he was part of the corner's infrastructure. The corruption did not reveal itself to strangers. The corruption moved through relationship, through familiarity, through the slow understanding that if you stayed still long enough and quiet enough, you would see what the people who ran things in this place had decided was normal. By 11:30 a.m., when the morning rush had mostly passed and there was a gap before the lunch crowd would begin, Damien made his first real choice as David Carr. He turned to Rosa's cart. She was prepping ingredients for the afternoon, her hands steady in their work, her eyes on what she was doing, and he said, "I'll take a coffee, whatever you recommend." Rosa looked at him. She did not smile. She prepared a coffee in a white paper cup, the kind all the carts used, and she handed it to him without being asked to add anything. It was black. It was hot. It was strong enough that the smell of it came up at his face like a small shock. He paid her $4. She did not try to give him change. "What kind of coffee?" he asked. "The kind that will keep you awake if you need to be awake," she said. He raised the cup and he drank it, standing there at the edge of her cart, with his apron still on and the smell of hot dogs still in his clothes. The coffee was too strong. It was too hot. It was exactly the kind of coffee that Marcus used to make on Sunday mornings when Damien came over, before the traffic stop, before any of this. Marcus standing in his kitchen in that small apartment he had rented, moving between the counter and the stove with the unself-conscious ease of a man comfortable in his own space. And he would make coffee the way their mother had made it, which was to say with no regard whatsoever for taste preferences, just the single-minded conviction that if you were drinking coffee at all, you might as well taste the coffee. Damien finished every drop. "Good?" Rosa asked. "Yeah," he said. "Good. You will be back tomorrow?" "Yeah," he said. "I'll be back tomorrow." "Then I will make better coffee," Rosa said. He did come back tomorrow, and the next day, and every day after that. For the 6 weeks that followed his arrival on the corner of Main and Callaway, he established his routine. He established his identity. He established the kind of quiet presence that did not demand attention, but was gradually impossible to ignore, not because he was remarkable, but because he was consistent. He was there every morning at 6:47. He was there until 2 p.m. on weekdays, and until 1 p.m. on Saturdays. He was closed on Sundays. He bought coffee from Rosa almost every day. He was polite to all the vendors on the corner. He did not ask questions about the collections, because he knew that asking questions was how you signaled that you were the kind of person who did not understand how things worked in places like this. He simply waited. The corner itself was a study in precarious commerce. There was Rosa's taco cart. There was the fruit stand where Marcus Santos, a 29-year-old Latino man with quick hands and quicker eyes, sold tropical fruits and fresh juice. There was Henry Okafor's pretzel cart. Henry was 73 years old, a Nigerian American who had been on this corner for 31 years, who had served 2 tours in Vietnam as a medic, who had hands that shook now, partly from age and partly from something he did not talk about. There was the shoe repair stand operated by an older Korean man named Park, who had been on the corner for 19 years and who spoke very little English. There were 4 other smaller vendors, a newspaper stand, a hot coffee and pastry vendor who came in before Damien, a woman who sold hand-knitted scarves, and an elderly black man who sold newspapers and magazines and used books that he collected from estate sales. Together, they formed the ecosystem of a block that was trying very hard to survive in a downtown district that had been slowly losing retail for the last decade. The storefronts were a mix of established businesses, the bodega, the laundromat, a dry cleaning establishment, a small law office, a check cashing place, and vacant spaces, windows covered in paper, spaces that had housed businesses and then had not housed them anymore. This was the kind of corner where a man could disappear into routine, where a man could stand and watch and nobody would think twice about it. By the end of the first week, Damien had logged the daily patterns of foot traffic. By the end of the first month, he had identified all the vendors and had established relationships with most of them. By the end of 6 weeks, he had earned something close to acceptance on the corner, not friendship, exactly, but the kind of recognition that meant you belonged, that meant you were part of the infrastructure. That meant you understood the spoken and unspoken rules of how to conduct yourself in a public space that was semi-private, technically open, legally operational, but running according to rules that were not written anywhere official. It was on a Friday morning during the second week of September, just as the brutal August heat was beginning to ease slightly, and the mornings were starting to come in a shade cooler, When the first collection arrived, Damien was standing at his cart, assembling a hot dog for a customer, a woman in business casual, moving quickly, checking her phone, when he heard the sound of a police car pulling up to the curb. Not a siren, just the arrival, the settling of the car's suspension, the doors opening, the sound of two officers exiting the vehicle. He did not look up. He finished assembling the hot dog. He wrapped it. He placed it in a paper container. He rang up the transaction. He took the payment. He made change. He smiled at the customer and told her to have a good day. Only then did he turn to see the two officers walking the line of vendors. They were both white. One was probably in his early 30s, tall and broad, with the kind of physical presence that suggested he had been big most of his life and had never learned to make himself smaller. His name tag said Norris. The other was younger, maybe 28, with close-cropped hair and eyes that moved across the vendors without emotion or recognition. His name tag said Fitch. They walked together, and they stopped at Rosa's cart first. Damien watched from his position. He could see enough to understand the basic transaction, a brief conversation, Rosa's posture changing slightly, something happening with her hands that suggested she was retrieving something. Then the exchange of money, Fitch pocketing what Rosa gave him without counting it, Norris smiling at something, though not in a friendly way. Then they moved to Henry's pretzel cart, then to Marcus Santos's fruit stand, then to Park's shoe repair stand. They collected from all four of them, moving with the methodical precision of a routine that had been perfected through practice. Nobody resisted. Nobody argued. Nobody did anything but hand over cash in response to questions Damien could not hear, but could certainly interpret. When they reached his cart, Damien was back to his work, already starting to assemble the next order for another customer, a man in work clothes carrying a lunchbox. He did not look up. Norris stepped to the edge of the cart. Well, he said. A new face on the block. Damien finished assembling the hot dog. He rang it up. He handed it to the customer. He took payment. Only then did he turn to face the officers directly. Can I help you, gentlemen? He asked. Polite, neutral. The kind of tone that suggested he understood they were in an official capacity, but also suggested he did not understand, or did not want to understand, what their official capacity actually required. Your name? Norris asked. David Carr, Damien said. How long you been on this corner, David? About 6 weeks, Damien said. And you understand the way things work here, David? The way business operates on this block? Damien said nothing. He turned back to his cart, back to his work. There was a rhythm to the moment, and he understood the rhythm. He was supposed to show some confusion, or some apprehension, or some sign that he did not quite understand what was happening. Instead, he showed nothing. He simply turned back to his supplies and began prepping for the next order. His hands steady, his face neutral, Fitch stepped closer. We're talking to you, he said. That's disrespectful, son. I'm not being disrespectful, Damien said, without turning around. I'm making sure I have hot dogs ready when the lunch rush starts. Is there something I can help you with? A long pause. Then Norris laughed. Actually laughed. A short, sharp sound that had no humor in it. You're new, he said, so nobody's explained the protection situation to you yet. Is that right? Damien turned back to them. He leaned against his cart's edge, crossing his arms. He had practiced this posture. He had practiced the quality of emptiness in his face, the absence of fear that would mark him as either stupid or dangerous. And the job here was to seem stupid. Stupid enough that he did not understand the threat. Stupid enough that he thought the rules were different for him. Protection from what? He asked. Fitch took a step closer. Up close, Damien could see the calculation in his eyes, the assessment of whether this particular vendor was going to be easy or difficult, the assessment of whether he could be scared. Things happen on this block, Fitch said. To carts that don't have the right kind of protection. Accidents. Vandalism. You get the idea. I don't, Damien said. He kept his voice level. I don't get the idea. Are you threatening me? Not threatening, Norris said from behind Fitch. Explaining, the arrangement here is simple. You pay $300 a month. Every Friday, you get to operate your cart without incident. You don't pay. Bad things happen to your cart. Sometimes bad things happen to you. So far, everybody on this block has decided that the arrangement is fair. The question is whether you're going to be reasonable or whether you're going to be difficult. Damien looked at Norris. Then he looked at Fitch. Then he reached into his apron pocket and he pulled out $300 in cash, which he had brought to the corner for exactly this moment, and he handed it to Norris. Every Friday? Damien asked. Every Friday, Norris confirmed. And I need to know the names of the supervisors at the police department, Damien said, in case I have questions about the arrangement. The two officers exchanged a look. It was brief, but Damien caught it, the moment of surprise, the recognition that this was not how the first collection usually went. Usually people were scared, usually people tried to negotiate, or they tried to refuse, and then they were shown the error of their ways. Usually people did not calmly hand over the money and then ask for the names of supervisors, as if this was just a normal business transaction requiring documentation. You don't need supervisor names, Fitch said. You just need to have the $300 every Friday. That's the arrangement. Understood, Damien said. They left. The collection was complete. All the vendors on the corner had paid their weekly tribute to the Kellerton Police Department, or more accurately to Sergeant Boyd Callahan and the two officers he had trained to be his hands in the world. They did not know, as they drove away from Maine and Callaway, that they had just collected money from a deputy U.S. Marshal who had been waiting for exactly this moment, not the moment of the collection, but the moment of the establishment of the pattern. Damien stood at his cart. His hands were steady. His breathing was steady. Inside his apron, a small recording device was documenting every word that had been said in the coming months. Damien would understand that this first collection was just the beginning of the narrative that would ultimately matter. This was the first time Boyd Callahan, though Damien did not know his name yet, though he did not have an image yet, though the name was still just an absence, had marked him as a vendor who paid without resistance, without emotion, without the kind of fear that usually informed the transaction. This was the moment when Callahan's confidence in the system began, in some subtle way that he would not understand until much later, to crack. The Friday collections became Damien's rhythm, every week. At approximately 10:30 a.m., either Norris or Fitch would arrive at the corner, sometimes both. They would move down the line of vendors with the methodical precision of a routine that had long since become so normal that nobody even thought of resistance anymore. They would stop at Rosa's cart. They would collect. They would move to Henry's pretzel stand. They would collect. They would move to Marcus Santos's fruit stand. They would collect. By the second month, Damien had completed a preliminary map of the operation. It was running through the Kellerton Police Department's patrol division, specifically through Sergeant Boyd Callahan, who was 56 years old and had been with the department for 17 years. He had two associates, Officers Kyle Norris and Dean Fitch, both younger, both white, both the kind of men who had learned that certain people in certain positions would not fight back, and who had built their income and their sense of dominance around that specific discovery. But there was a structure beneath the structure. The complaints that vendors made to internal affairs at the police department were being sealed before they could reach any external authority. There was someone inside the department who was participating in the protection of the operation, someone who received a cut. Damien estimated 10% of the monthly take, which would be somewhere in the neighborhood of $4,000 per month from the 12 vendors who were being extorted. Damien needed a name. Damien needed confirmation. Damien needed the whole architecture laid bare. What he had instead was a coffee cart and the daily observation of the corner, and the slow, patient work of documenting evidence that would eventually matter to someone. Rosa remained his constant. Every morning, she had coffee waiting for him. Good coffee. Better than what she had promised. Made fresh from beans she was grinding herself because, as she told him one morning, a man who finishes his coffee, no matter what, has earned the right to decent coffee. They did not speak about the collections. They did not speak about what was happening on the corner. They spoke about nothing that mattered, which meant they spoke about everything. About Rosa's grandchildren, about the neighborhood's slow transformation over the years, about the kinds of customers who came and went, about the rhythm of the seasons as they moved from August's brutal heat into September's marginally forgiving warmth. Henry Okafor, by contrast, seemed to be watching Damien with a specific kind of assessment. Henry had been on the corner for 31 years. He had seen vendors come and go. He had seen economic shifts reshape the neighborhood. He had seen the collections begin 4 years ago. And he had paid every month without complaint, the same way he had accepted many other things in his 73 years of living in a world that had not always made room for people who looked like him. But Henry was also a Vietnam veteran. He was also a man who had learned, over a lifetime, how to recognize patience in another person, how to understand the specific quality of stillness that came from training, not from fear. One morning, about 3 weeks into Damien's presence on the corner, Henry came over to the hot dog cart, and he ordered a hot dog with everything, and he stood eating it while looking out at the street, and he said, without preamble, "You're not really a hot dog vendor." It was not a question. Damien did not respond immediately. He finished prepping the next order. He rang it up. He placed the hot dog on the counter. He did not look at Henry. "I'm exactly what I appear to be," he said finally. "A man with a hot dog cart." "Sure," Henry said. "And I'm exactly what I appear to be. A man with a pretzel cart. But we both know that's not the whole story. The question is, which side are you on?" "The side of people who are being hurt," Damien said quietly. He still was not looking at Henry. "I'm on that side." Henry nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he had already suspected. He finished his hot dog. He placed the paper container in the trash. He turned to leave, then paused. "Be careful," he said. It was the same warning Rosa had given, but with a different weight to it. The weight of someone who had learned through experience what careful cost. "Always," Damien said. It was in the 5th week of the assignment, during the second Friday collection, that Damien witnessed the first significant escalation. Marcus Santos, the fruit vendor, had been short, $30 short. He had miscounted, or there had been theft from his stand. or he had simply underestimated how much he needed to make in the morning hours to cover his payment. When Fitch counted the money Marcus handed him, he looked at Marcus and he said, "This isn't right." Marcus's face changed. "I can have it tomorrow," he said quickly. "I was short this week. I'll make it up next week." Fitch looked at Norris. Norris did not say anything. He simply nodded. What happened next unfolded in the kind of slow motion that violence often occupies in the moment of its arrival. Fitch stepped closer to Marcus. Norris positioned himself to block any potential escape. And then Fitch said, very quietly, "We explained how this works. You pay $300 every Friday. The arrangement is simple. You make it simple, or you make it complicated. You seem to be making it complicated." He hit Marcus once, in the stomach, with the kind of precision that suggested he had practiced this particular strike many times before. Marcus went down. He was trying to catch his breath, trying to scramble backward, but his stand was behind him, and there was nowhere to go. Norris stepped forward, and he grabbed Marcus's arm, and Fitch hit him again, in the ribs this time, and then once more in the back as Marcus tried to protect his face. A few people on the street had stopped. A few people had seen. Nobody did anything. Nobody called the police. Nobody intervened. Damien stood at his cart, and he watched, and inside him, the entire architecture of his discipline was being tested. The thing he had learned over 11 years in the public corruption unit, which was that you did not intervene in the moment. You did not stop the violence when it was happening, because stopping it destroyed the case you were building, destroyed the investigation that would eventually matter, destroyed the possibility of justice for all the people who had been hurt before, and all the people who would be hurt after. Instead, you watched, you documented, you felt the specific weight of that watching in your body, the way it pressed on your chest like a hand, and you understood that this was the cost of waiting. This was what standing still required. They took $40 from Marcus's register to make up the $30 shortfall, plus an additional penalty. Then they left. Marcus was on the ground, his breath coming in short, painful gasps, his hand pressed against his ribs. Rosa came over immediately. She was across the cart from him, and she had seen everything. She helped him up. She got him water from her cooler. She looked at Damien. Their eyes met for a moment that held an entire conversation. Then Rosa turned back to Marcus, and she began assessing his injuries, asking him questions. Her hands gentle and her face composed in the way that only a woman who had lived through violence could manage, with the specific knowledge that this was what the world was, and the specific commitment to help anyway. Damien stood at his cart, and his hands were steady, and his breathing was steady, and inside his body. The echo of Marcus's impact against Fitch's strikes was reverberating like a bell. That night, in the small apartment that was rented under the name David Carr, Damien recorded his observations for the case file. He documented the date, the time, the nature of the escalation, the specific actions taken. He documented that Marcus Santos was showing signs of physical injury. He documented that the violence was being used as an enforcement mechanism, that it was not spontaneous or uncontrolled, that it was methodical and practiced. He documented everything except the feeling that was moving through his body, which was the feeling of anger so profound and so carefully controlled that it felt almost like a separate thing living beneath his skin. A second heartbeat, a second breathing, a second presence that wanted to do something about what he had seen. But he had made a choice, years ago. When Marcus died and the investigation into his death was closed, and no officer was charged, and the department ruled the shooting justified. He had made a choice to channel this feeling into the work, to let it fuel the patience instead of destroying it. This was not the first time he had made this choice on the corner of Main and Callaway. It would not be the last. By the end of the 7th week, Damien had enough preliminary evidence to begin requesting expanded surveillance from his handler. A small camera had been installed above the door of the laundromat next to Rosa's cart, placed there by federal technicians who had come in a black van in the early morning hours. A second camera was placed on the corner of a building across the street, giving them multiple angles on the collection process. Audio surveillance was also in place. The small recording device in Damien's apron was documenting every interaction on the corner. 2 separate federal recording devices had been positioned in the street, relaying real-time audio to a van that was sometimes parked 3 blocks away, sometimes parked in different locations on the rotation that kept it from being obvious. The investigation was moving from preliminary assessment to active documentation, but it was also moving into territory where the violence was escalating. Henry Okafor's beating came in the 7th week, during the second Friday collection of the investigation. Henry had been short, $180 short, a miscounting or a shortfall that he tried to explain in the careful, measured way of a man who had learned over a lifetime how to speak to authority with respect while protecting some core of dignity within himself. "I apologize," he said to Fitch. "I made an error in my accounting. I will have the full amount tomorrow. I will bring it to the station myself if that is necessary." "That won't be necessary," Norris said. He was smiling, but it was not a smile with warmth in it. It was the smile of someone about to inflict something he had inflicted many times before. What happened next was, in some ways, worse than what happened to Marcus, because Henry was older and his body was more fragile, and because the beating went on longer. There was no one stopping them, no one setting a limit, no one deciding when it was enough. Norris held Henry while Fitch struck him, in the ribs and stomach and back, methodical and controlled. Norris called him by degrading names, Fitch explained, between strikes. That this was what happened when you did not follow the arrangement. That this was what happened when you disrespected the police. That this was the price of your mistake. Henry eventually managed to protect himself enough that they stopped. He was bleeding from his mouth. He was breathing in short, painful gasps. He was very clearly injured badly enough to require medical attention. Rosa went to him immediately. Other vendors stood frozen. A few customers on the street had stopped and were watching, and nobody did anything, and nobody called the police, and nobody intervened. Damien stood at his cart. This time, something inside him moved. Some line was crossed. Some boundary was breached. This time, the anger that had been sitting beneath his skin since the first beating of Marcus Santos rose up like something with a physical shape, like something that wanted to break through his body and act. He thought about Marcus. He thought about the traffic stop that had ended with his brother dead on a Tuesday afternoon. He thought about the investigation that had closed without charges, without justice, without anything but the closed door of an official ruling of justified. He thought about the 11 years he had spent waiting since then, and he did nothing. He finished his work. He served his customers. He documented everything in the small recording device in his apron. He made the mental note that would, months later, become the central piece of evidence against Boyd Callahan and Kyle Norris and Dean Fitch and whoever was protecting them inside the police department. When the police car left, when the vendors had scattered, When Rosa was helping Henry into a cab to take him to the hospital, Damien called his handler. "We're moving to phase 2, he said quietly, into a burner phone, standing in the back room of a closed shop 3 blocks away from Main and Callaway. "Understood," Lieutenant Carl Whitmore said on the other end. "We're moving assets into position. Full team surveillance as of tomorrow. You will have backup at all times now." "What about Henry?" Damien asked. "Hospital records will be documented. Medical reports will support future testimony. The evidence is building. You're doing good work. Cross." Damien hung up. He stood in the back room of the closed shop, and he felt the weight of everything he was carrying, the weight of the investigation, the weight of the waiting, the weight of the choice he had made to stand still while people were hurt. It was a weight he had learned to carry, but it never got lighter. Boyd Callahan was, in many ways, a man of meticulous habits. He arrived at the police station every morning at 6:45 a.m. He spent the first hour reviewing paperwork, checking on the status of his officers, ensuring that the patrol assignments for the day were distributed appropriately. He had a coffee at the small break room at 7:30 a.m. Black, no sugar. The kind of coffee that suggested a man who did not have time for preferences. By 8 a.m., he was in his office, and by 9 a.m., he was in patrol, working the same downtown district that generated the majority of his income. He was 56 years old, with the kind of physical bearing that suggested he had once been significantly more athletic than he was now, but had maintained enough of his size to suggest that he could still be dangerous if the situation required it. He had been with the Kellerton Police Department for 17 years. He had a commendation for bravery. He had attended a community policing workshop in 2015. He had a family, a wife named Margaret, a daughter named Allison, who was in college in Austin, a son named David, who was married with 2 children and worked in IT somewhere in Dallas. To anyone outside the downtown district, Boyd Callahan was a competent sergeant who ran an orderly patrol unit inside the investigation that Damien Cross was conducting. Boyd Callahan was the center of an operation that was generating approximately $50,000 per month through organized extortion of vulnerable business owners. By the 8th week of the assignment, Lieutenant Carl Whitmore had brought in additional federal agents. There was an agent named Monica Price who worked financial crimes and was developing a detailed accounting of the cash flows. There was an agent named Thomas Webb who was managing the surveillance operation and was beginning to identify the chain of payments that moved money from Callahan to Fitch to Norris and back to Callahan. And also, this was the critical piece, up the chain to someone inside the police department who was protecting the operation. The mole in the department had not been identified yet. That was a problem. The bigger problem was that Marcus Santos, the fruit vendor who had been beaten after being short on his first collection, was becoming nervous. He had filed a report about the vandalism to his stand. Snitch in red spray paint across the entire cart. His produce scattered across the ground. The message clear. Dean Fitch had taken the report without writing anything down. The incident was being ignored. Marcus came to Damien one morning, about a week after the vandalism, while there was a lull in customer traffic. "I know what you are," Marcus said quietly. Damien did not respond immediately. He continued assembling a hot dog that he had just started, his movements steady, his attention on the work. "You're federal," Marcus continued. "Police don't act like that. The way you stand, the way you look at things. You're federal. You're investigating this, aren't you? The collections." "I'm not going to have this conversation," Damien said. He finished the hot dog. He set it aside. He turned to face Marcus directly. "What I'll tell you is that what's happening to you and Henry and the others is being documented. It's being recorded. It's being preserved for legal action. And the best thing you can do is stay quiet and stay safe. Henry's in the hospital, Marcus said. His voice was shaking slightly. My stand was vandalized. You're telling me to stay quiet? How is staying quiet keeping me safe? It keeps you alive, Damien said quietly. That's the equation here. You stay alive, and we build the case. And at some point, we have enough to move. Until then, quiet is the only safety there is. Marcus left. He did not seem satisfied, but he seemed to understand. He returned to his fruit stand, and he continued his work. And he did not make any additional reports to the police. And he did not talk to any other vendors about what he suspected. But the knowledge was out there now. The knowledge that there was a federal presence on the corner was moving through the ecosystem, and that meant the timeline was compressing. On the first Friday of the 9th week, when Kyle Norris arrived for his collection, something had changed. He was more alert. His eyes were moving across the corner with a different quality of attention, the attention of someone looking for something he could not quite see. He collected from Rosa. He collected from Henry, who was back, moving slowly, his ribs still clearly bothering him, but present on his corner anyway. He collected from Marcus Santos, and then he came to Damien's cart. You know, Norris said, we've been thinking about you, the new guy with the hot dog cart. Been here about 8 weeks, and you've been real cooperative, real understanding about the arrangement. No resistance, no questions, no problems. That's how I operate, Damien said calmly. I understand how things work. Do you? Norris said. It was not a question. Because here's the thing. A man who understands how things work usually knows something about the corner. He knows what's happening. He knows who's paying and who's not. He knows the business. I know enough, Damien said. But here's what's bothering me, Norris continued. We've been getting the feeling, lately, that there's something happening on this corner that we don't know about. Something that makes the vendors nervous. Something that makes them say things like, I know what you are, to guys with hot dog carts. You know anything about that? Damien looked at Norris. He kept his face empty. No, he said. You sure about that? Norris asked. Because if I find out that you're the reason the vendors are getting nervous, if I find out that you're saying things you shouldn't be saying, there's going to be a problem. And the problem is going to be real. You understand me? I understand, Damien said. Norris nodded. He looked at Damien for a moment longer, trying to read something in his face that was not there, trying to find a crack in the facade that was being presented to him. Then he pocketed the $300 and he left. That afternoon, in a parking lot 3 blocks from Main and Callaway, Damien met with Lieutenant Carl Whitmore and Agent Monica Price. He's suspicious, Damien said without preamble. They're hunting now. They know something is wrong. They just don't know what. We need the mole's name, Monica said. Without the mole, we can't prove the conspiracy reaches into the department command structure. We can prove Callahan and his officers are extorting vendors, but we can't prove internal affairs is being used to protect the operation. I don't have the mole yet, Damien said. We're running out of time, Whitmore said. If they close ranks before we can prove the chain of command, all we have is street-level extortion. That's significant, but it's not the full structure. We need the person inside. I know, Damien said. Can you accelerate? Whitmore asked. Damien thought about Marcus Santos saying, I know what you are. He thought about Henry Okafor in the hospital. He thought about Rosa Fuentes, who looked at him sometimes with the kind of knowledge that suggested she understood more than she was saying, but was choosing not to acknowledge it because acknowledging it might require her to do something. Maybe, he said. But the acceleration has costs. All of this has costs, Whitmore said. The question is whether you can keep moving forward. Yes, Damien said. I can keep moving forward. What he did not say was that there was a part of him that did not want to keep moving forward anymore. There was a part of him that wanted to take Norris and Fitch and lock them in a room and make them explain themselves. There was a part of him that wanted to walk into Boyd Callahan's office and lay out everything he knew and ask the man to explain how he had managed to become the kind of person who beat an old man for missing $30. But those parts of him were not allowed to speak. Those parts of him had been trained, over 11 years, to be silent. The acceleration came 2 weeks later. When Damien received information from Agent Monica Price about the cash flow patterns, Callahan was meeting someone once a week in a warehouse on the industrial edge of town, and that someone was accepting a cash payment. The someone had not been identified yet, but the pattern suggested it was either Deputy Chief Raymond Toole or someone acting on Toole's behalf. If Damien could get closer to one of those meetings, if he could document the exchange, they would have everything they needed. So on a Tuesday evening, Damien closed his hot dog cart an hour early. He told Rosa he was not feeling well, and Rosa looked at him with those eyes that suggested she understood much more than what was being said. And she told him to take care of himself. He drove to the industrial district. The warehouse was not operational. It had been abandoned years ago during the last economic downturn. But it was in a location where vehicles could pull in without being obviously visible from the street. It was the kind of place where a police sergeant would choose to meet someone if that someone did not want to be seen meeting a police sergeant. Damien parked his car 3 blocks away and he approached on foot. He had a camera with a long lens. He had a secure communication device. He had a plan that was entirely dependent on nobody noticing him, which was a fragile plan, which was the kind of plan that usually did not survive contact with reality. He was positioned near the entrance of the warehouse when the first vehicle arrived. A marked police car, Deputy Chief Raymond Toole emerging from the driver's side, moving toward the warehouse entrance with the kind of casual confidence that suggested he had been here before. 30 minutes later, a second vehicle arrived. A civilian car, sedan, dark blue. Damien positioned himself to get a clean photograph of the driver as they entered the warehouse. And he got exactly what he was looking for. A clear image of Sergeant Boyd Callahan arriving to meet with his supervisor. They were inside for 17 minutes. The time corresponded to previous meetings Monica Price had documented. The pattern was consistent, the evidence was building. Damien was repositioning his camera to get a better angle on the warehouse door when he heard a voice behind him. "Don't move," the voice said. He moved. His training took over, the Army training, the Marshal Service training, the 11 years of operational experience. He pivoted, his hand going to the Glock that was holstered beneath his shirt, his body moving in the way that had been drilled into him so many times that it had become automatic. Boyd Callahan was standing 15 feet away, weapon drawn, face dark with something that looked like rage and something that looked like recognition. "You're him," Callahan said. "You're the reason the corner's been different. You're the one who's been watching." "I'm exactly what I appear to be," Damien said, his own weapon now drawn, his hands steady, his eyes on Callahan's eyes. "A man with a hot dog cart." "No," Callahan said. "You're federal, You're some kind of federal agent or prosecutor or something. I can see it now. The way you moved. The training. You've been on my corner this whole time. Collecting evidence. And I didn't see it until I looked at the surveillance footage from the warehouse parking area. I saw you moving like a man who knew how to move. And suddenly, everything clicked. "Drop the weapon," Damien said. "Drop it and step back." "I don't think so," Callahan said. "I think you're going to drop your weapon, and we're going to have a conversation about what you think you're doing, investigating a police officer without proper authorization or oversight." "I have oversight," Damien said. "I'm a deputy U.S. Marshal. What you're running is federal extortion. It's conspiracy. It's organized crime. And you've got approximately 60 seconds to decide whether you want to die in the parking lot of an industrial warehouse or whether you want to drop your weapon and face the legal system." There was a moment where everything hung in balance. There was a moment where Callahan was actually considering his options, where the decision was genuinely unclear, where the outcome could have gone either direction. Then there were red and blue lights flooding the parking lot, and federal agents were emerging from vehicles that had been positioned strategically around the warehouse. And backup was arriving in the form of 3 marked police cars and Lieutenant Carl Whitmore, who had been coordinating the entire operation from a distance. Callahan dropped his weapon. It was the moment Damien had been waiting for, the moment of the arrest, the moment when the case became real, the moment when everything he had been building for 18 months suddenly became something concrete and official and real. But there was no triumph in it. There was no relief. There was only the understanding that they now had Callahan in custody, which meant they needed to work backward to get the mole, which meant they needed to put enormous pressure on Callahan to turn on his supervisor, which meant they needed to accelerate the entire timeline that Damien had been carefully managing, all of which meant that the waiting was over. The work was about to begin in earnest. Rosa Fuentes was not asleep when she received the call at 3:47 in the morning. Sleep, in the last 6 months, had become an increasingly rare thing. It would come in fragments, in moments of deep exhaustion that would suddenly arrive and then disappear just as quickly, leaving her awake in the darkness with her mind moving in circles around the same thoughts. She had known, for some time now, that something was happening on the corner. She had recognized the signs in David Carr's attention, in the subtle shift in the way he stood and watched and waited. She had seen federal agents in unmarked cars. She had heard about Henry's beating and had tried not to connect it to whatever David was investigating, because connecting those things meant understanding that the investigation was still ongoing, which meant the danger was still present, which meant the threat that had been hanging over her head for 4 years was not diminishing, but was about to intensify. She had been paying Sergeant Callahan and his officers $300 every month for 4 years. 4 years times 12 months times $300. $14,400 given to men in police uniforms. $14,400 that she had never mentioned to her children, because she did not want them to worry, because she did not want them to think the system that was supposed to protect them was actually preying on them. Tonight, this morning, at 3:47, the phone call came from Agent Monica Price, who identified herself and said that they needed Rosa to come to a federal office, that they had some questions, that this could not wait until morning. Rosa got out of bed. She had been asleep for 37 minutes. She had checked the clock when she lay down at 3:10. She dressed in her ordinary clothes. She did not leave a note. She did not wake Clara. She simply got in her car and she drove to the federal building downtown. And she was ushered into a small room where 2 federal agents were waiting. And they began very carefully, to explain to her that the man who had been collecting money from her for 4 years was under arrest, and that she would need to testify, and that her testimony would be central to proving the scope of the extortion operation. "I don't want to testify," Rosa said immediately. "I don't want any of this to go to court. I just want it to be over." "It will be over," Monica Price said, "but it has to go through the system first. You're one of the primary victims. Your testimony is critical." "I have a family," Rosa said. "If I testify, if I go public with this, what happens to the other vendors? What happens to my business? What happens to my life?" "What happens is that the person who has been extorting you goes to prison," Monica said. "What happens is that the system actually works." Rosa did not feel like the system was working. Rosa felt like she was being asked to participate in something that had consequences she could not fully see. That might damage her business. That might damage her standing in the community. That might fundamentally change her relationship to the corner she had been standing on for 11 years. But she also understood that refusing to testify was not really an option. The federal government could compel her testimony. They could make her cooperate. And so she sat in that small room with 2 federal agents asking her questions about how much she paid, when she paid, what she had been told would happen if she did not pay, and she answered every question. And she understood that her life as she had known it was about to change. When she finally left the federal building, it was 6:15 in the morning. She did not go home. She drove to the corner. The corner was empty at 6:15. The stores were dark. The street was quiet. She unlocked her cart and she began her morning routine. The slow heating of the oil, the arrangement of the already prepared ingredients, the laying out of the fresh onions and cilantro, the work that had kept her present on this corner every day for 11 years. She thought about her late husband, who had built the cart by hand. She thought about her 3 children, who did not know the truth about where she had been spending her money every month. She thought about her 7 grandchildren, who came to the corner sometimes on weekends and helped her serve customers, and were entirely innocent of the fact that their abuela was paying protection money to avoid having the cart vandalized or destroyed. She thought about Henry in the hospital, his ribs broken, his body learning what it cost to be short by $30. She thought about David Carr, who she had known almost from the beginning was not a hot dog vendor, but was something else, something federal, something that was trying to fix what was broken. She had not asked him directly, and he had not told her directly, but there was an understanding between them, a knowledge that needed no words. At 6:47, David arrived, as he always arrived, with his cart, and he began setting up for the morning. He was moving more slowly than usual. His eyes were different. Something in them had shifted. The look of a man who had crossed some threshold, who had seen something on the other side of waiting that changed what it meant to continue waiting. Rosa handed him coffee without being asked. Too strong, too hot. The way she had been making it for him for almost 3 months. "I was brought in for questioning," she said quietly. "They want me to testify." "I know," David said. "I'm sorry. I wish I could have protected you from that." "You can't protect people from the truth," Rosa said. "That's one of the things I've learned in my 64 years. The truth doesn't protect you. It just makes things harder, and you have to be strong enough to survive the harder." She watched him drink the coffee. He finished every drop. He always finished every drop. "My daughter Clara," Rosa said, "she works here sometimes. She doesn't know anything about the collections, about why I paid. If this goes to trial, to court, it will all come out. She will know her mother paid money to police officers to avoid having her business destroyed. That will be public. That will be real. Yes, David said. I can't tell you that won't happen. Tell me why I should cooperate, Rosa said. Tell me why I should let my life be destroyed for a case that might not even succeed. David set down his coffee cup. He turned to face her directly. He stood there for a moment, silent, and she could see him thinking, could see him calculating what to say, could see him looking for words that would be honest rather than comforting. Because if you don't, he said finally, there will be another corner in another city, and there will be another sergeant with another 2 officers, and there will be another Rosa and another Henry and another Marcus, and they'll pay, and they'll stay quiet, and the system will protect itself. The only thing that breaks the cycle is someone saying no, someone telling the truth in public, in court, in a place where the truth can't be ignored. Even if telling the truth destroys me? Rosa asked. Even then, David said. That's the weight of it. Rosa turned back to her work. She began arranging the afternoon's ingredients, her hands steady despite the weight of everything that had been laid bare. She had a family. She had a business. She had a life that was about to be fundamentally disrupted by being honest. But she also understood what David was saying. She understood that the weight of silence was sometimes heavier than the weight of speaking. I'll testify, she said, but I want you to know, if my business is destroyed, if my grandchildren find out their abuela was extorted, if my life falls apart, that's on you. That's your responsibility. I know, David said. I understand the cost. Over the next 3 days, everything accelerated. Deputy Chief Raymond Toole was arrested. The federal government filed charges against Boyd Callahan, Kyle Norris, and Dean Fitch. The mole inside the department had been identified. It was Toole, who had been receiving 10% of the monthly collection, approximately $50,000 per year in exchange for sealing complaints at Internal Affairs. The case had a structure now. It had a narrative. It had all the pieces that a federal prosecution would need to prove in court. That organized extortion had been happening on the corner of Main and Callaway for 4 years, and that it had reached up the chain of command into the office of the deputy chief. Rosa was scheduled to testify before a federal grand jury on Wednesday. On Monday evening, she called her daughter Clara. I just wanted to hear your voice. Mija, she said. There was nothing alarming in her tone. There was nothing that would suggest she was about to change everything. Tell the children their abuela loves them. Clara was in Houston, working as a nurse at a hospital. She could not hear the weight in her mother's voice because her mother had learned, over 64 years, to carry weight silently. Clara just said she would, that the children would be happy to know, that she would call Rosa back on Saturday as usual. After they hung up, Rosa sat in her small house for a while. She thought about the corner. She thought about the smell of masa, which had been her constant for 11 years. She thought about customers who became friends, who came to her cart not just for the food, but for the conversation, for the greeting, for the feeling of being seen and acknowledged by someone who cared about their day. She thought about David Carr, who was not David Carr, but was something federal, something trying to fix what was broken, and she thought about how his stillness and his patience and his understanding had somehow made it possible for her to say yes. Yes to disruption. Yes to public testimony. Yes to the destruction of the safety she had built through 4 years of quiet payment. She went to bed at 11:30 p.m. She did not sleep. She lay in the dark, and she thought about everything, and she felt the weight of the grand jury testimony that was coming, and she felt the weight of the trial that would follow. and she felt the weight of her family finding out what she had been doing for 4 years. Sometime around 2 a.m., she fell asleep. She did not wake up. The cardiac arrest came at 3:47 in the morning, the same time she had received the call to come to the federal office, the same time that had marked the beginning of the end of her life as she had known it. Her heart, which had been bearing the accumulated stress of 4 years of threats and fear and silence and the final decision to speak, simply stopped. She died in her sleep. The neighborhood learned by morning. Damien Cross received the call at 7:15 in the morning. It was from Lieutenant Carl Whitmore, and the first thing Whitmore said was, "Rosa Fuentes is dead." Damien was standing at his cart, setting up for the morning. He had arrived, as always. At 6:47 a.m., he had begun the routine: the gas canister, the griddle, the cooler, the supplies. He had done this every morning for almost 18 months, and the routine had become something automatic, something that did not require his conscious attention, which meant his conscious attention was free to move elsewhere. It was now entirely elsewhere. How? Damien asked. Cardiac arrest, Whitmore said. In her sleep. The medical examiner is calling it natural causes, but we both know the reality. 4 years of stress, of threats, of fear, of knowing that the system was predating on her. Last night, after the grand jury testimony, she couldn't sleep. The stress triggered an episode. She died. Damien stood at his cart. He did not respond. He understood. In the way you understand something that has been intellectually known, but is now being felt with full force. The cost of the waiting. Rosa was dead. She was not going to testify at trial. She was not going to see Callahan or Norris or Fitch convicted. She was not going to see the system that had been created to protect her actually protect her. She was dead. We proceed without her testimony. Whitmore said, Henry Okafor can testify. Marcus Santos can testify. The financial records can speak. The recordings can speak. We don't need Rosa anymore. The case will move forward. She cooperated, Damien said quietly. She agreed to testify. I know, Whitmore said. And her daughter will inherit that knowledge. Her family will inherit that knowledge. And eventually, they'll understand that their mother died for something that mattered. That understanding is worth something. Damien hung up. He stood at his cart, and he understood, in a way that was almost visceral, the thing that had been underlying the entire investigation for 18 months. The thing Marcus had taught him. The thing that standing still on corners required. The understanding that justice did not arrive in time to save people. The understanding that sometimes people died while you were building the case that would eventually matter. The understanding that being the person who waited was the hardest role in the entire system. At 8 a.m., Henry Okafor came to the corner, as he did every day, and he began setting up his pretzel cart. Henry did not yet know that Rosa was dead. The neighborhood was still learning. The word was still spreading. The reality had not yet reached everyone on Main and Callaway. Damien watched Henry work. He watched the careful way Henry moved, the way his ribs still seemed to bother him, the way his hands shook occasionally. He watched the old man who had survived a beating, who had survived Vietnam as a medic, who had survived 73 years in a world that had not always made room for people who looked like him. At 8:47 a.m., Clara Fuentes arrived at her mother's cart. Damien did not know who she was at first. She was a woman in her late 30s, wearing scrubs, looking like she had come directly from a hospital shift. She was standing at the taco cart, and she was looking at all the carefully organized ingredients. And she was looking at the cart itself with the kind of understanding that suggested she knew what everything here meant, what this space represented, what her mother had been doing every single day for 11 years. A young man from the bodega came over and said something to her. And Damien watched Clara's face change, watched the moment the reality of her mother's death became real, became something that could not be explained away or misunderstood. She sat down on the curb, right there at the corner of Main and Callaway, and she cried. Damien closed his cart at 11 a.m. He told Henry he was going to take the rest of the day. Henry looked at him and nodded, because Henry understood without being told what had happened and what it meant. Damien walked to the hospital where the medical examiner's office was located. He did not have an official reason to go. He was not the primary investigator on Rosa's death. Her death was being classified as natural causes, and there was no investigation because there was nothing to investigate. A 64-year-old woman with cardiac risk factors had experienced a cardiac event. But Damien walked into the medical examiner's office anyway, and he identified himself as a federal agent with an interest in the case, and he asked to see the preliminary findings. What he found was what he had already known. Rosa had died of cardiac arrest. The strain on her heart was consistent with prolonged stress. The toxicology was clean. Everything in the medical evidence pointed to a simple, brutal fact. The fear had killed her as surely as any weapon could have. He stood in the medical examiner's office, and he understood that the case against Boyd Callahan could not include the fact of Rosa's death, because Rosa's death was not a direct result of anything Callahan had done. Rosa had died because the system had been designed to prey on her. And because she had chosen to fight back against that system, and because the weight of that fight had been more than her body could bear, justice did not account for that. Justice did not have a box for the accumulated weight of fear. He went back to the corner. It was late afternoon by then, the light coming in at an angle that was starting to suggest autumn, and the heat of August was finally, permanently, giving way to something slightly less brutal. Henry was still at his pretzel cart. Marcus Santos was still at his fruit stand. Some of the other vendors had come, drawn by the knowledge that Rosa was gone, that the corner had changed. Clara was still there. She had been there all day, waiting in the office behind her mother's cart, trying to understand what her mother had been doing, trying to understand how her mother had paid $300 every month without telling anyone, trying to understand how a woman could carry that weight for 4 years and then simply die. Damien approached her. He did not have an explanation that would help. He did not have words that would make sense of what had happened. But he understood that he owed her something. Not a full truth, not yet, but at least the acknowledgement that her mother had not been simply a victim. "Your mother was brave," he said quietly. Clara looked at him. She was red-eyed from crying. She had the look of someone who had just experienced an irreversible change in her understanding of the world. "I don't know you," she said. "No," Damien said. "But I knew your mother, and I know that she made a choice, about a week ago. That took more courage than most people will experience in their entire lives. She chose to speak truth, even though it was going to cost her. She chose to fight, even though she was tired." "It killed her," Clara said. "I know," Damien said. "And that's an injustice that I can't fix. That's a cost that I can't undo. But I want you to know that her choice is going to matter. It's going to result in convictions. It's going to result in a system change. It's going to matter." "My mother is dead," Clara said. Nothing matters more than that. Damien had no argument against that. He stood there with the truth of it, and he understood that there was no response that could possibly be adequate. He simply turned and he walked back to his cart. He closed up his business for the evening. He packed away his supplies. He left the corner as the sun was setting, and he drove to a federal office. And he spent the evening documenting everything: Rosa's death, the impact on the case, the decision to move forward despite the loss of her testimony. He documented it all in the kind of precise, bureaucratic language that was designed to strip away emotion and replace it with procedure. He documented the facts. He did not document the weight. He did not document the understanding that standing still while people suffered and sometimes died was the price of the kind of justice that actually moved through the system. He went back to his apartment. He sat in the dark for a while. He thought about Marcus, his brother, not Marcus Santos. He thought about the traffic stop that had ended with his brother dead. He thought about the 11 years that had passed since then. He thought about all the corners he had stood on since then, all the cases he had built, all the waiting he had done. He thought about Rosa, who had chosen to speak, who had cooperated, who had agreed to disrupt her entire life, and who had paid the ultimate cost for that cooperation. He thought about the fact that Boyd Callahan would most likely be convicted, that Kyle Norris and Dean Fitch would most likely be convicted, that Deputy Chief Raymond Toole would most likely be convicted, and he thought about the fact that none of that would bring Rosa back. The system would work. Justice would move through the bureaucracy. Consequences would arrive. But Rosa would still be dead, and Clara would still be a daughter who had just discovered that her mother had been paying extortion for 4 years, and Henry would still have broken ribs and nightmares. And Marcus Santos would still have watched his stand be vandalized. This was what it cost to wait. This was what it cost to stand still. And tomorrow morning, Damien would go back to the corner. He would go back to Maine and Callaway. He would stand at his cart. He would wait for the customers. He would serve the hot dogs. And he would understand that the waiting was not over, that the case still needed to be built, that the trial still needed to happen, that the conviction still needed to be secured. Rosa's death did not change the timeline. The investigation did not pause for grief. The system did not stop moving just because someone had been lost in its gears. The work continued. It was never done. The trial began in November, 3 months after Rosa's death. The courthouse in Kellerton was a 7-story building of gray stone and tinted windows, the kind of building designed to suggest that justice happened inside its walls. Though what justice really happened was the slow movement of system through procedure, the careful presentation of evidence, the legal arguments that sometimes mattered and sometimes did not. Damien testified on the 3rd day of the trial. He sat in the witness chair and he described his 18 months of undercover work on the corner of Main and Callaway. He described the collections. He described the violence. He described the beating of Marcus Santos. He described the beating of Henry Okafor. He described the fear that had permeated the corner, the way the vendors had learned to expect that paying money to police officers was simply the cost of doing business. The prosecuting attorney was a woman named Jennifer Walsh, who had dedicated her career to prosecuting corruption cases and had the kind of focus that suggested she understood the weight of what she was doing. She walked Damien through the testimony with the care of someone who knew that his testimony was the spine of the entire case. "Did you ever intervene in the violence?" Walsh asked. "No," Damien said. "Why not?" "Because intervening would have compromised the investigation." because destroying the case would have meant that there would be no consequences for the corruption, because I had made a choice at the beginning of this work that I would document and I would wait, even when waiting meant standing still while people were hurt. That was difficult? Walsh asked. Yes, Damien said. It was very difficult. The defense attorney was a man named Robert Schilling, who had defended white-collar criminals and police officers for 23 years. He walked Damien through a different set of questions. You're claiming that my client participated in extortion, but you never once heard him explicitly demand money, did you? You never once heard him make a specific threat, did you? The threat was implicit, Damien said. The pattern of behavior created the threat. The violence against other vendors created the threat. The understanding that non-compliance would result in consequences that created the threat. But you didn't hear it stated clearly, Schilling pressed. No, Damien said. I didn't need to. The people being extorted understood the threat. They paid the money because they understood the threat. The threat was clear enough. Henry Okafor testified on the fourth day. He described the beating in careful, measured language, and he described the understanding that had come to him slowly over many years that certain people in authority would not respect him, would see him as prey, would take what they could take from him without consequence. I served my country, Henry said, his voice steady despite the pain in his ribs that still caused him to wince occasionally. I served in Vietnam. I did my duty. And then I came home and I stood on a street corner for 31 years. And I paid money to people who were supposed to protect me. And when I was short $30, I was beaten by those protectors. That's the system. That's what the system does to people like me. Callahan's attorney tried to discredit Henry, tried to suggest that Henry had fallen, that Henry's story had been influenced by federal agents, that Henry was mistaken about what had happened, but the recordings were clear, the video was clear. The surveillance captured the beating in meticulous detail, and there was no way for Callahan's attorney to argue that Henry had simply fallen and injured himself. Marcus Santos testified on the fifth day. He described the vandalism of his stand, the message left in red spray paint. He described the beating after his first collection. He described reporting the vandalism to Officer Dean Fitch and having Fitch not write anything down, having his complaint be essentially ignored by the police department. I knew what the message meant, Marcus said. I knew it was being suggested that I shouldn't talk to anyone about what was happening. I knew that speaking was dangerous. Federal agents testified about the financial records. Monica Price presented the accounting of the cash flows, the pattern of payments from Callahan to Fitch to Norris, and then back up to Deputy Chief Toole. She presented the bank records showing deposits into accounts that did not align with the officers' stated salaries. She presented the mathematical impossibility of the financial pattern, except under the explanation of organized extortion. The case was not complicated. The evidence was overwhelming. The pattern was clear. By the time the prosecution rested, it was obvious that Callahan and his officers had been running an extortion operation for 4 years, that Deputy Chief Toole had been protecting them, that the entire operation had been possible because the vendors had no other recourse, no one to go to, no way to refuse without consequence. On the 7th day of the trial, Damien sat in the courtroom and he listened to the closing arguments. Jennifer Walsh described the impact of the extortion on the vendors. She described how Rosa Fuentes had paid $14,400 over 4 years. She described how that money had come from her livelihood, from her family's security, from the life she had been building on that corner. Rosa Fuentes Walsh said, and she paused. And the weight of that name in the room was enormous. Cooperated with federal investigators, she agreed to testify. She agreed to disrupt her entire life to bring justice to this case. And on the night before she was supposed to testify, she died, not as a result of any action by the defendants, but as a result of the accumulated weight of 4 years of fear. 4 years of knowing that the people sworn to protect her were the ones preying on her. That weight was too much for her heart to bear. She looked directly at the jury. Rosa Fuentes is dead, and we cannot undo that. But what we can do is ensure that her death was not in vain. What we can do is ensure that the people who created the system that killed her face consequences. What we can do is ensure that this never happens on Main and Callaway again. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. They returned with guilty verdicts on all charges. Boyd Callahan was convicted of organized extortion, conspiracy, and violating the civil rights of the victims. Kyle Norris was convicted of organized extortion and assault. Dean Fitch was convicted of organized extortion and assault. Deputy Chief Raymond Toole was convicted of conspiracy and misprision, the federal crime of failing to report or prevent a felony. Sentences were handed down 2 weeks later. Callahan received 12 years. Norris received 7 years. Fitch received 5 years. Toole received 4 years. Damien sat in the courtroom during the sentencing, and he listened to the judge explain the reasons for the sentences, and he watched Callahan being led away by marshals. And he understood that this was the moment that was supposed to feel like victory, like the successful conclusion of an 18-month investigation, like the point where the waiting had been justified. But there was no triumph in it. There was only the understanding that Callahan was going to prison, yes, and that his officers were going to prison, yes, but that Rosa Fuentes was still dead, that Henry Okafor's ribs were still broken, that Marcus Santos's stand had still been vandalized, that the corner of Main and Callaway had been fundamentally changed by what had happened there. Justice had moved through the system, but it had not arrived in time to save anyone. Damien left the courthouse and he went to the federal building and he formally closed the case file. Monica Price was there, and she and Damien sat for a moment in the aftermath of the conviction, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing adequate to say. "Are you staying with the service?" Monica asked eventually. "Yes," Damien said. "There's another case in Houston, another corner, another set of victims waiting for documentation." "That's going to be hard," Monica said. "Yes," Damien said. "It is." He went back to the corner one last time. It was a Thursday evening, just before closing time. Henry was at his pretzel cart, and Marcus was at his fruit stand. And there were other vendors who had moved in since the arrest, people who did not know the history of the corner, who did not understand what had cost to clear it of corruption. Damien sold hot dogs for 2 hours. He served customers. He operated the cart with the same precision and care that had characterized his 18 months on Main and Callaway. Then he packed up his supplies. He paid his final bills on the temporary restaurant license that had been his cover. He said goodbye to Henry, who looked at him with the kind of understanding that suggested Henry knew exactly who he was and what he had done, and had known for some time. "Thank you," Henry said, simply, "for standing on our corner, for waiting, for building the case." "I'm sorry about Rosa," Damien said. "Rosa made her choice," Henry said. "And her choice mattered. Her daughter knows that now, and her grandchildren will know that someday. She will be remembered as someone who fought back, not as someone who was broken." Damien drove away from the corner. He drove through downtown Kellerton. and he drove past the bodega and the laundromat and the dry cleaning establishment. He drove past the vacant storefronts and the police station where Callahan had reported to work every morning for 17 years. He drove back to his temporary apartment, and he packed his belongings, and he turned off the lights, and he left no forwarding address, because David Carr had been a temporary identity, a ghost created for the purpose of investigation. A man who had lived in Kellerton only long enough to bring justice to a corner. 8 weeks after the sentencing, Damien returned to Kellerton. Not in any official capacity, the case was closed. The investigation was concluded. The convictions were secure. He was not supposed to be there. But there was something that had not been finished, some small thing that required completion. And so he returned to the corner of Main and Callaway on a November afternoon, when the light was coming in at an angle that softened everything it touched. And the brutal heat of August had been replaced by something almost cool. He had changed his appearance. His hair was different. His beard was longer. He was wearing clothes that David Carr would not have worn, clothes that belonged to Damien Cross, the marshal, the federal agent, the man who had spent 18 months pretending to be someone else. He did not set up the cart. He simply stood on the corner, observing, taking in the changes that had occurred in the weeks since his departure. Rosa's taco cart was still there, but it was being operated by Clara Fuentes now. She had left her job at the hospital. She had come to the corner, and she had learned her mother's recipes, and she had taken over the work. And she was developing her own relationship with the vendors and the customers. And there was something in the way she operated the cart that suggested she understood what her mother had been doing, understood the weight of it, was honoring it by continuing the work. Henry Okafor was at his pretzel cart, moving slightly more easily now. His ribs healed, though the trauma of the beating would probably never fully leave him. Marcus Santos was at his fruit stand, and his cart had been repaired and repainted, and the message of snitch was gone. Though the memory of it would probably remain, Park was at his shoe repair stand, and the new pastry vendor was in her usual spot, and the newspaper seller was at his usual position, and the corner was functioning again as a functioning ecosystem. Damien watched for a while. He was watching Clara specifically. She was moving with the kind of confidence that suggested she was comfortable on the corner, was understanding her mother's relationship to this place, was making it her own. At one point, she emerged from the cart with a fresh cup of coffee. She looked around, as if she were looking for someone specifically. Then she saw Damien. She did not recognize him. He had changed enough, and it had been enough time. That recognition did not come immediately, but she came over anyway, and she handed him the coffee. "I don't know your name," she said, "but I think you knew my mother." "Yes," Damien said, "I did. She told me a few weeks before she died," Clara said. "She told me she thought you were something more than a hot dog vendor. She said she thought you were someone trying to do something." I didn't understand what she meant at the time, but after the trial, after everything came out, I understood. You were the one who brought down the people who were extorting her. You were the federal agent. "Yes," Damien said. "I want you to know something," Clara said. "My mother talked about you at the end. She said that your coffee cup was always empty, that you finished every drop of coffee, no matter how bad it was. She said a man who did that was a man with a purpose." Damien did not respond immediately. He looked at the coffee that Clara had handed him. It was too strong. It was too hot. It was made the way her mother had taught him to make it, the way his brother had made it, the way it was supposed to be made. He raised the cup and he drank it. "She was right about people," Clara said. "My mother had a gift for understanding what people really were. She understood what you were from the beginning." "I'm sorry I couldn't save her," Damien said. "You can't save anyone," Clara said. "My mother understood that. What you can do is fight for them. What you can do is wait with them. What you can do is bring justice after the fact. That's what she understood. That's why she made the choice she made." Damien finished the coffee. Every drop. "I have to go," he said. "I know," Clara said. "You're going to go to another corner, in another city, and you're going to stand there and watch and wait for 18 months, and you're going to build another case. That's what people like you do." "Yes," Damien said. "Be careful," Clara said. It was the same warning her mother had given, but with the knowledge of what that warning really meant, what it cost, what it required. He waved at Henry before he left. Henry waved back, not the hurried wave of someone greeting a customer, but a different wave than that, a wave that was larger, slower, the wave of a man who knows who he is waving at now and means it completely. He saw Rosa's daughter at the taco cart one more time. She did not know who he was. She handed him a cup of coffee without being asked. Too strong, too hot. He drank every drop. Henry came over. They stood together for a while, the way they had stood at Rosa's corner the day of the arrest. Nobody spoke for a long time. Then Henry said, "She told me, a few weeks before she died, she told me she thought you were something more than a hot dog vendor." "What did she think I was?" Damien asked. Henry considered this. "She said she thought you were someone trying to do something. She did not know what, but she said your coffee cup was always empty. She said a man who finishes his coffee, no matter how bad it is a man with a purpose." A pause. "She was usually right about people," Henry said. He went back to his cart. Damien stood at the corner for a while longer. The November sun was lower now, the light different. Not the brutal flat glare of August, but something quieter, coming in at an angle, catching the chrome on the carts and the windows of the storefronts and the edge of Clara's apron as she worked. He thought about Marcus, his brother, the one who had called him on a Sunday and had left a voicemail that Damien had never deleted. He thought about the traffic stop that had ended with his brother dead. He thought about the 11 years he had spent waiting since then. He thought about Rosa saying, "Be careful around here." He thought about the 7 key tags on her ring, 7 grandchildren that she had mentioned once, each one represented by a key she had carried in her pocket, like a reminder of why she was standing on this corner, why she was doing this work. He thought about finishing every cup of coffee, no matter how bad it is, because a man with a purpose does not leave things unfinished. He walked back to his car. He had another file waiting in Houston, another corner, another person who had called a tip line and gone quiet. The work was not done. It was never done, but it was moving, and he was the person moving it, and that had to be enough. 11 years ago, Marcus Cross called his brother on a Sunday afternoon. Damien was on shift. He let it go to voicemail. Marcus talked for 1 minute and 43 seconds. He talked about a show he had watched. He talked about a neighbor's dog. He talked about a new place that made good barbecue. He said he would call again next Sunday. He said, "Okay, I love you, bro. Pick up next time." 3 days later, a traffic stop. An officer who thought Marcus fit a description. An escalation nobody planned and everybody watched. Marcus Cross, 23 years old, dead on a Tuesday afternoon in a city that spent 4 days calling it justified, before it spent the next 11 years not calling it anything at all. Damien has never deleted the voicemail. Tonight, in a hotel room in Houston, with the new case file open on the laptop and the TV on mute and the Kellerton drive still in his body like weather, he takes out the old phone. He opens the voicemail application. He sits with his thumb over the play button. He does not press play. He has not pressed play in 11 years. He does not need to hear it. He knows every word. He just needs to know it is still there. The lamp is on. The case file is open. The room smells like the hotel soap that every hotel uses. The specific generic smell of a room that belongs to nobody permanently. He has slept in approximately 400 of these rooms. He stopped noticing the smell 3 years ago. He puts the phone back. He closes the case file. He turns off the lamp. In the dark, he thinks about Rosa handing him coffee without being asked. He thinks about Henry's hand on his shoulder. Brief. Specific. Enough. He thinks about Clara's laugh, which does not always reach her eyes, but is real anyway. He thinks, this is what I can do. I cannot bring anyone back. I cannot close the gap. I can stand on corners and watch and wait and document and bring the case and take the hit and stand back up and do it again on the next corner in the next city. That is all I can do. It is not enough. It is what I have. He sleeps. The phone stays in his pocket. The voicemail stays intact. The work continues in the morning.